Well, today we're going to look at Chapter 30, which is, not only have you moved into the 30s from the 20s, but probably more significantly, you're at the last participle chapter. So that's good. Today we're going to look at perfect participles. In other words, these are the participles that we'll use to indicate completed action, just like the perfect does in the indicative. And we'll start by playing our little guessing game, because you already know this, I think. Lelucatis. What's that? Tell me what you know. Okay, you've got a reduplication, so you know you're into the perfect system. Okay, you've got a tense formative in the kappa, but something's a little different, isn't it? What was the tense formative in the perfect indicative? Kappa alpha, which goes to kappa epsilon in the third singular. Here you have kappa followed by an omicron. Well, actually, and again, there's some debate on this point, but I view just the kappa as a tense formative. So you have the tense formative kappa. What else do you have? You got a form of luo, and you have, for the participle morpheme, omicron tau. Okay, so here's the last of those morphemes. Nu tau has normally been the one that's been used, but in the perfect active, the participle morpheme is omicron tau, and then you have the appropriate case endings, right? Because the tau is a consonant, it takes third declension endings, so you have epsilon sigma. So lelucatis is a perfect active participle, nominative plural masculine, okay? Agapecatis. Okay, it's pretty much the same thing, except there's one thing that might kind of stand out to you as being a little unexpected. Or maybe you just know it so well, yeah, sure, obviously. Yeah, you'll notice on agapecatis, the first eta is still long. Now, what happened to augments in aorist participles? Okay, they dropped out. Why is the eta still long? I mean, obviously, this is from agapao. Right, because it's a vocalic reduplication. It's not an augment. It looks like an augment, but it's performing a different function in the perfect tense. It's indicating completed action. So when you have a perfect stem that lengthens the initial vowel as vocalic reduplication to indicate the perfect, when you get into the non-indicative, that long vowel remains. Okay? It's not indicating past time, so it doesn't have to drop out. Lelumenas. What's your participle morpheme? You have the men. You have the middle passive morpheme. You have reduplication. You notice you have no tense forms. You have no connecting vowels. That's the big sign of the perfect middle passive, right? So lelumenas is a perfect middle passive participle. And in this case, I left it nominative singular masculine. Okay, are these three forms clear? Again, if you're working on how words are put together, most of this should make sense. So how are you going to translate a perfect participle? Well, as a very general rule, you'll probably use after and then having. In other words, you're still using have like you do in the indicative, but because it's a participle, in English, that's the part of the verbal construction that gets the ing. So after having and then your verb. Sesokatis is from what form? What word? Sozo, very good. And so this would be translated after having saved. If this were a passive participle, how would you have translated it? After having been saved. Okay, that's more English than anything else. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Okay, just to break them down, let's look at the perfect active. How do you form the perfect active? You have reduplication. You have your perfect tense stem. You have your tense formative, which is the simple kappa. You have the participle morpheme, which is ot, omicron tau. And then you have the appropriate case endings. The 6 forms you're going to learn are kos, quia, kas, katas, quias, katas. Go, what happened there? Well, start with the genitive. Katas, for the masculine neuter, that's straightforward, right? But you can see what happens in the feminine. The ot goes to huia. If you go back up into the nominative, you can kind of see what happens, can't you? In the masculine, you have the sigma. The tau drops off. The omicron lengthens to an omega. You get kos. And in the neuter, you have a sigma also, and the tau drops off before sigma, but the vowel doesn't lengthen. So you get cos. Now again, it's not important that you go through those gyrations. You just need to memorize the 6 forms, but I think it's helpful if you know what's actually going on. In the perfect middle passive, it's reduplication, perfect middle passive tense stem, the appropriate participle morpheme, which is mana or mene, and then either a second or a first declension case ending. And so your forms are menas and then whatever, right? Menas, mene, mena, menu, menes, menu. Okay, that's the end of the actual forms of the participle. But there's 2 other situations that I'm going to give you in this chapter that you need to be aware of. The first is called the genitive absolute. The genitive absolute is one of those constructions that if you don't recognize it in the verse, you'll get really, really frustrated. But the minute you see, oh, it's a genitive absolute, it gets really simple. Okay, here's the deal. Let's say you were reading along and read tu Iesu genethentas magoi eilthon. Well, magoi eilthon, the Magi came, and then you've got this genitive of Iesu, and then genethentas is what? Okay, it's a genitive singular from genao, aorist passive, having been born. You're going to look at that and you go, why are those genitives there? The Magi of Jesus? No. The Magi of having been... No, that's not right. See the problem? And you can sit there and scratch your head on these things, and they can get really frustrating until you recognize that those first 3 words constitute a genitive absolute. Okay, what's a genitive absolute? Well, it's a noun or a pronoun and a participle in the genitive case, and they're not grammatically connected to anything in the sentence. That's why it's called a genitive absolute. They're grammatically unconnected. In other words, there's nothing for the noun or the pronoun or the participle to modify. They're just kind of out there. Now, you don't have to have the noun or a pronoun. Every once in a while, we'll have a genitive absolute that's nothing but the participle. But normally, there's a noun or a pronoun with it. So a genitive absolute is when you have a noun or a pronoun and a participle in the genitive, and they're not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. What happens in genitive absolutes is when the writer wants to describe an action that's being done by someone or something other than the subject of the sentence. So you have the Magi coming, and you have Jesus being born. And so that's usually the situation where these genitive absolutes pop up. They also tend to come at the beginning of a sentence in narrative material. When you read through Matthew, what you're going to find in the narrative material, there's a lot of genitive absolutes. And that's just where they tend to occur. At the beginning of a sentence, when the writer is telling a story, and the person who's doing the participle is different from the person who's doing the main verb or the thing. All right? Those are kind of some of your contextual clues that you're looking at a genitive absolute. So the question then becomes how to translate a genitive absolute. Well, generally they're temporal. And so you're generally going to be able to use while or after and an ing form of the participle. The word that's in the genitive, the noun or the pronoun in the genitive, it's acting as if it's the subject of the participle. Now, technically, participles can't take subjects, right? But in a genitive absolute, the word that's the noun or pronoun in the genitive is acting as if it's the subject of the participle. So in our illustration, you have tu Iesu in the genitive, and then you have the participle. So you would translate it after being born, after having been born. Oh, it's Jesus who has been born. So the rule is you can use while or after. If the subject of the participle is expressed, you will generally turn the participle into a regular verb. After Jesus had been born. Genitive absolutes are idiomatic. You can't go word for word with them. If there is no noun or pronoun in the genitive, you just say, after having been born. Just use the ing form, all right? So genitive absolutes are normally temporal. You can use while or after. If there is a noun or a pronoun in the genitive, go ahead and translate it as the subject of the participle, which means you're going to have to translate the participle as a regular verb. And if the subject is not expressed, then just use ing for the participle. Again, like I said, they're pretty straightforward once you recognize that it's a genitive absolute. If you don't recognize that it's a genitive absolute, you can scratch your head for a long time. And the final thing you need to know about participles is that we have something in Greek called a periphrastic construction. It just means it's a roundabout way of saying something, periphrasis. And what they did was they came up with a construction to emphasize the continuous action of a verb. And they would take a form of a me and join it with a participle in order to stress that it was a linear or an ongoing, a continuous action. So how would you just translate ein didaskon? Yeah, so they're pretty straightforward. You would tend to say he was teaching. And that's the great way to translate these things. Now, words can come in between the form of a me and the participle. So sometimes you go, oh, there's a me, there's a participle. But originally this was a way the Greeks had to stress that an action was truly linear. Now, what's happened over time is that emphasis has been lost. And there are quite a few periphrastic constructions in the New Testament where there is no emphasis on the linear action. And all you have to do is simply look at the context and say, is this going to be stressing its continuous nature of the verb or not? And this chart is in the book, and you can look at it. But as you can see, there's actually 6 different tenses that you can construct periphrastically. And it's a present, imperfect, or future form of a me with a present participle, or a present, imperfect, and future of a me with a perfect participle, to construct those 6 different tenses. It's really not that big of a deal. When you see a me and you see the participle, you realize they're working together, you'll find that the translation is very straightforward. Well, done with participles. Cool.